Hey everybody, welcome back to GitHub for Windows users. I'm still Jeremy and this is still Brianna. And we are still talking about GitHub for folks that are accustomed to, comfortable in the Windows environment, maybe working on Windows code or Microsoft code and things like that. So we've covered a number of topics. Let's have a glance at the agenda. We looked at the basic concepts and the GitHub workflow. We looked at GitHub in the browser and we looked at GitHub in a native client on Windows. Now we're going to look at a means by which, in my experience, you're probably more likely to be using Git, and that is integrated directly into your IDE. GitHub is we talked about how you can use it for things besides code, but for the most part, people are using it for writing code, right?
Exactly. And if your workflow as a developer really starts and ends in your IDE, it's nice to have something that's going to work with that. And GitHub offers a lot of integration, so you can integrate directly with your text editor.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about GitHub integrations in Visual Studio. Now, in this module, I'm going to talk to you first about the GitHub extension for Visual Studio. This is kind of the flagship main integration point if you use Visual Studio. But then I'm also going to talk about another integration called the Bing Developer Assistant, which is pretty cool. And it accesses GitHub, and so it's could be considered an integration point. I think it'll be interesting to see how that works. Next, we're going to look at Visual Studio Code. In case you're not familiar, Visual Studio Code is a newer, lighter, free version of Visual Studio that's cross-platform. It's actually developed entirely in Node.js and TypeScript using the Electron environment. And so it's cross-platform. You can install it on your Mac or Linux or Windows, whatever you choose. And so it's a really exciting browser. I absolutely love it. It's my day-to-day. And it has really good Git integration. And then we're going to look at some Visual Studio extensions, which are even deeper Git integration. And I think it's just an absolute blast. So I think we're going to have some fun with these. But first, let's look at the GitHub extension for Visual Studio. Now, this one I specified on here for Visual Studio 2015. GitHub extension for Visual Studio. It's currently the best way to use Git in Visual Studio. There was an older plugin extension called Visual Studio Tools for Git that's still going to work, but there's no reason not to go use GitHub extension for Visual Studio. It's a better integration, it does a better job at handling the distributed source control paradigms and putting things in the right place. So I'm going to do this in the form of a demo. So we're going to actually open Visual Studio now. And the Visual Studio that I'm opening 2015. You can see that I'm opening the Community Edition. Now the Community Edition is the free edition of our full Visual Studio. So it's good for small teams, startups, students, free for these types of cases. And it's really the full version of Visual Studio. I like to call it Visual Studio proper as compared to Visual Studio Code, which is altogether different. Now, once that's open, you'll see that Visual Studio, I'm going to guess that you're familiar with it. If you're not, it's a very robust, very full-featured IDE, and it's capable of working on all kinds of different projects, but it can be more heavy. That's why we have Visual Studio Code, because Visual Studio proper is sometimes overkill for certain kinds of light projects. But in Visual Studio, including the free version, Visual Studio Community, we have this concept of extensions. And those extensions all exist under Tools, Extensions, and Updates. So let's go there, and let's look at our first integration, which is the GitHub extension for Visual Studio. I'm going to type GitHub here, and that should be enough to find it. This is finding it in my local installs. If I click Online, which you'll have to do the first time if you don't have it installed by default, you'll find the GitHub extension for Visual Studio, lots of information about it, and the little check mark says that it's already installed. In fact, I already have this installed, so let's just go ahead and start looking at that integration, okay? Now, probably the first pane that you'll be on when you open Visual Studio is the Solution Explorer. That's how you see all the files in your solution. If you want to deal with source control, regardless of which source control you choose, then you're going to want to go to the Team Explorer pane in Visual Studio. And on that Team Explorer pane, the first thing that you want to do to get started with GitHub is to click the Connect button. Now this Connect button is going to show a section on GitHub, and I'm going to go ahead and click Sign Out here so that I emulate the experience that you'll have when you start this up the first time. you'll see this GitHub area, and it gives you an opportunity to sign up as a user on GitHub, or if you already have an account, you can just go ahead and click on Connect. It's going to ask you to log in. And there you have it. Now we are signed in to GitHub. So GitHub recognizes some repos that I've already added here. And you'll find that the integration points for it are scattered a little bit in the UI here. And so I just kind of want to point out where those actually exist. Here on the Connect tab, I do have the opportunity to do a clone or a create. So let's go ahead and hit clone, and you can see that once again this is pulling all of those locations, all those organizations that I'm a part of. And in fact, in this case, it's also bringing up Brianna's account and allowing me to attach directly to that demo project. Now, I've already got that one on my machine, so let's just go ahead and fake this up here. Let's go ahead and remove the demo project. Pretend like that doesn't exist. It doesn't now. And let's go ahead and clone it. And what's the problem with that? Let's try that again. Clone the demo project. There we go. It found it before, and then I tricked it by deleting that. Okay, so now I have this project. Now there's one interesting thing to note here. If you're looking at your GitHub repo online or in a tool, you usually have an easy means to see all of the files that are part of that project. But when you're in Visual Studio, you don't necessarily get that. Because Visual Studio is interested only in code, and it's only interested in projects, and it rolls projects up into solutions. So it's going to kind of look in this repo for a solution file, and if it exists, then it's going to show it to you there. But it's not going to give you a list of all the readmes and things like that. Now, this repo, as you remember, we just added a readme and a little index.html, so this doesn't have a solution in it yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that demo project. I'm going to double click on that down here in my local version of it. And then inside there, I'm going to see this list on the bottom of the solutions that are inside of that repo, which there are none. Okay? Now let's go ahead and click New here. And we'll create a new solution. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to create a very simple console application in C#. And in this case, I'm not going to create a new Git repository because I know that I'm already inside of a larger Git repository. And there we have it. Now we have, or at least locally, we have a repo that has a solution inside of it. Okay? Let's go jump over to the browser and we'll look at this demo project. And obviously it doesn't exist up here. Okay,
right.
We haven't pushed anything up. But it exists here on our local machine. And I'm going to go ahead and just call this the initial state of the application. And let's go ahead and get this one in. Now, I haven't created a branch yet, but I have made a change. Is it possible for me to create a branch after I've made some changes?
Yes, that's a good point. So maybe you've made some changes, you've actually changed the files, but you haven't committed them yet. Git is always keeping an eye on what's in your working directory, is what they call it. So once you have some changes in your working directory, even if you don't have a branch yet, you can create another branch and then check out to that branch, start working on that branch. And Git's going to know, okay, those files are still going to be in the working directory on this branch. And when you commit them or when you get them ready for staging by adding them, they're in that staging area and ultimately will be put into history as a commit on that branch.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go in this directory where I have the my GitHub repo. I have branches, and I can click on that, and I can manage my branches in here, but I want to point out on the very bottom right corner of the screen, and I'm supposed to be magnifying here, there we go, on the very bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see that I've got some real handy indicators. I can see that I'm on the master branch, I can see that I'm in the demo project, I can see what my changes are and what my if I'm behind master on the remote. And if I click on my branch, I can say right here that I want a new branch. So this is real handy, and it opens the UI for me, and I just say this is going to be add the console app. That's, oh, actually this is the name of the branch, so I can't do that. Let's just call it console app. There we go. And this is going to be a branch off of master. And after I create this branch, I also want to check it out. So I leave that check mark checked, create that branch, and now if I go back to home, that home button is really handy. The home button gets you back to all of these options that have to do with the management of your Git repositories. So the changes, we saw the branches, the changes have to do with commits, seeing which files have changed, committing them, and everything. And you can guess on maybe the rest of them. I'm going to go ahead and click on the changes. And sure enough, it says it looks like you've added an entire directory structure here. A Visual Studio project is usually bigger than other style projects. It's got a project file, a solution file, it's got this assemblyinfo.cs and the program.cs, and that's where my code actually exists. It's inside the program.cs. But I want all of this. This all represents a project. So let's go ahead and call this my add new console app. And I'm on my, am I on my right branch here? I've looked down at the bottom. Oh, I'm on master. I thought I had actually switched that to create nope, I don't want create HTML. Didn't I create a new branch? I thought we did this together. Let's try this again.
Either way, it's a nice functionality that you can double check, that it's visible and it's easy to add in at any point. That's awesome.
Console-app is what I wanted to call that, and I wanted to branch off of master, and I wanted to check that out. And a branch with that already exists, so it's apparently just not refreshed. Let's go look at our branches and refresh those and make sure that we've got the latest. There's console app. It was a little bit confused, but that's okay. We'll go to changes. There's our changes. It's still got my commit message, and the branch is in fact console app. So it was doing it right. It just wasn't refreshed, which is unfortunate. So you might run into that exact same case where it doesn't actually refresh for you, and now you've seen me do it, and you know that it might be perfectly normal. Okay, let's go ahead and now, even though I made those changes before I created my branch, I went back and I fixed it, and I made sure that I followed the right procedure here. I created my branch, created my commits, commit all. It was successfully created locally, doesn't exist on the server yet, and now this branch exists only locally, this console app branch, and if I sync this with the changes on my server, then it's actually going to publish that branch, and then that will exist on the server. We could follow that workflow, but let's just kind of assume that we've done all that and we've done it right. But what I want to do now is, you've seen a number of the things that you can do in the GitHub integration for Visual Studio. You saw the branches and the changes. Understand that the sync is a little bit of an abstract concept, that it actually is a pull as well as a push. So it's synchronizing your changes that you have locally with what's on the server, but it's doing it in multiple steps, a pull and then a push. And as you may know, a pull is actually multiple steps. So what's really happening when you do a sync is you're doing a fetch, getting everything from the server, merging it into your active branch, and then you're pushing. So all of that is happening when you click the sync button.
Yes, and we'll get in a little bit more detail in Module 5 for how exactly those commands work, just each by themselves.
Yeah. Now, if you're doing this in Visual Studio and you want to do a pull request or you want to look at issues, it looks like you can do them right here, right? Well, watch this. If I click on pull request, what really happens is it jumps me out to the browser and I do it there. So that's actually good. You know, you're going to be using the browser to do that workflow, and that's a really good way to do it. And at least you have all your context and you have your ability to work with your changes in your IDE. That's what's really important. Okay, so back to the IDE, we do have a new solution here, and we're going to use that code to give us a jump in or a lead in to the Bing Developer Assistant demo.